The storm didn't just fall on the prairie, it swallowed it whole. Snow came down in white walls, a relentless, blinding fury that erased the world. Fences vanished, roads disappeared. The lantern hanging on the porch of the Harper Ranch became a tiny, swimming star about to drown in an ocean of white. Lisa staggered through it, a thin shawl ripped from one shoulder, two small bundles clutched to her chest. The babies. They were only hours old, and their whimpers were so faint, like tiny birds caught in the gale. Her own breath was a ragged cloud in the freezing air. Her lips were cracked. Her cheek was a swollen purple map of pain where her husband's hand had landed. Every part of her screamed to just lie down, to curl up in the snow and let the storm take her, let it be over. But then one of the bundles stirred, a tiny seeking sound, a life that refused to be silent, and it was a sound her heart couldn't ignore. She tightened her grip. Daughters. 2 of them. Ezekiel had spat the word like a curse. He'd paced the kitchen floor while she was still bleeding, his muddy boots scarring the pine boards. Worthless mouths, he'd snarled. God's curse on this house. Then he'd taken the cradle her own father had made and smashed it into splinters right in front of her. His rage was a cold, sharp thing, colder than the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. Then came the back of his hand across her face. And the order. Take them out into the night. Get rid of them. He didn't care if it was wolves or the frost that claimed them. They were a shame he wouldn't bear. She found herself stumbling across the yard, her body a furnace of fever and pain, cast out of her own home. The barn rose up in the swirling white, a dark promise of sanctuary. She threw her shoulder against the heavy wooden door, grunting with the effort until it slid open just enough for her to slip inside. The air was thick with the smell of hay, leather, and warm animals. The horses nickered softly, their breath steaming in the gloom. She collapsed into a pile of straw, her back against the rough wall, clutching her daughters so tight they finally went quiet. Tears streamed down her face, hot for a second before the cold stole their warmth. "Forgive me," she whispered, rocking them. "Mama tried." Time blurred. Her pulse felt slow, thick. She remembered her mother's voice, a ghost from long ago, telling her a woman's worth was measured in the sons she bore. A son to carry the name, to work the land. Daughters were just another mouth, another dowry, another burden. Shame. It was a stone she'd carried her whole life. And now, bruised and abandoned in a barn in the middle of a blizzard, she thought that stone might finally be her grave. The snow pressed against the barn walls. The wind whistled a funeral dirge. She let her head fall back, the darkness a welcome blanket for her tired eyes. Maybe this was mercy, the only kind she had left. Her daughters shifted against her, tiny fists curling, their warmth the last little ember in a world of ice. And that's when she heard it. A sound that wasn't the horses, a sound that wasn't the storm. It was a heavy, deliberate hush, like a deep breath being drawn in and held. The barn door groaned open again, fighting the wind. A slice of pale, ghostly light fell across the straw. A figure stood in the doorway, blocking it completely. He was massive, broad-shouldered, his skin dark like polished wood, covered in scars that told stories of 1,000 battles. Snow clung to his long, black hair, melting against the impossible heat that seemed to roll off him in waves. And he was shirtless, bare to the storm. His eyes, dark and steady, found her in the shadows. They locked onto the 2 bundles in her arms. Lisa froze. Every whispered story she'd ever heard in town came rushing back. Apaches in the hills, fierce, untamed warriors, killers. And here one stood, a giant carved from some older, harder world, looking right at her. She clutched her babies tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to speak, to beg, to explain, but the words were tangled in her throat, choked by shame and terror. What would he see? a broken woman cast out like trash, clinging to two infants the world didn't want. But he didn't move. He didn't raise a hand. He just stood there, the snow swirling around his powerful frame, his gaze so steady it felt like he was measuring her soul. There was no judgment in his eyes, just a silence that was heavier than the storm, heavier than the whole world. The horses shifted in their stalls, their hooves thudding nervously on the packed earth, but even they fell quiet when his gaze swept over them. It was as if the barn itself, the very ground, was holding its breath. Lisa finally found her voice, a raw, broken whisper. "If you mean to take us, then take us quickly." The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, his movement fluid and silent. He closed the heavy door behind him with a firm push, and the howl of the storm was instantly dulled to a low murmur. The world outside vanished. He knelt by the old fire pit in the center of the barn, a place they only used for branding. He struck a piece of flint against steel. A single spark jumped, then another. He coaxed it gently, until a tiny flame flickered to life in the kindling. The glow spread, painting his scarred chest in liquid gold, throwing the hard planes of his face into sharp relief. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. One of her daughters stirred, turning her tiny face instinctively toward the new warmth. For the first time since their birth, Lisa felt their small bodies relax against hers. She stared at him, caught between fear and a flood of disbelief. A stranger, a savage from the hills, had just done what her own husband would not. He had kindled a fire. He had offered shelter. And he hadn't spoken a single word. His gaze lifted from the fire and settled on her again. But he wasn't looking at her bruised face or her torn shawl. He was looking at the tiny faces of her daughters. And his eyes softened. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter, older. Something that looked like reverence. He reached out a hand, his movements slow, deliberate, his palm open. Lisa flinched, pulling back instinctively, but he stopped, letting his hand hang in the air, letting the warmth of the fire fill the space between them. Her daughters whimpered, their tiny fists twitching in their sleep. The stranger lowered his hand, resting it on the straw. He was steady, patient. He was waiting for her to choose. Lisa closed her eyes, the shame pressing down on her, but underneath it, something small and tight inside her chest began to loosen, a tiny thread of defiance. She shifted one of the bundles, letting the firelight catch the curve of her newborn's cheek. The man's gaze deepened. Snow hissed against the barn roof. For a single heartbeat, the world stopped. There was no storm. There was no Ezekiel. There was only the crackle of the new fire and the heavy silence between them. Where she had expected death, she found fire. Where she had expected judgment, she found a silence that held no condemnation. And in that silence, she felt a promise that these two small lives were not burdens. They were not a shame to be thrown away. They were worth holding. The man's shadow stretched across the straw, covering her and her children like a shield. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, like a river flowing deep beneath winter ice. "They will not die here." And as the fire crackled, Lisa realized with a jolt that the night and her life was no longer hers alone. The fire grew, its light dancing across the old wood of the barn walls, turning the shadows into swaying ghosts. Lisa held her daughters, her body humming with a strange mix of terror and relief. Every time the stranger moved near the flames, her breath would catch, her muscles tensing. But he asked no questions. He made no demands. He had simply walked out of a blizzard and brought warmth into a place that had promised only a frozen death. His silence was a strange comfort, but it was also deeply unsettling. Who was this man? One of the newborns began to stir again, her cry thin but insistent. Hunger. Lisa winced, rocking the baby with arms that felt like lead. Her body ached, exhausted and empty from the birth. Ezekiel had stormed out of the house hours ago, cursing her, cursing the daughters she'd given him. She wondered if he even remembered she was out here. If he cared. The stranger moved. His steps were slow, almost unnaturally quiet on the dirt floor. He seemed to know that any sudden movement would startle the horses, would startle her. He took a pail, broke the thin layer of ice in the trough just outside the door, and brought it back full of water. He set it near the fire, where the heat sent steam curling into the air. He placed it within her reach, but not too close. He seemed to understand her fear, respected the invisible line she had drawn around herself and her children. Her throat was raw, her lips parted, but all that came out was a cracked whisper. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a hawk's. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "The storm led me." She just stared at him. It wasn't an answer. His chest was still bare, the melting snow in his hair the only sign that he'd just walked through a blizzard. His shoulders bore the jagged, pale lines of old scars, scars from knives, scars from bullets. This was a dangerous man, a man who lived with violence, yet he showed none of it to her. He didn't look at her with greed or lust or even pity, just a quiet watchfulness that made her skin crawl even as it calmed her racing heart. Her daughter's cries grew sharper, more desperate. Lisa's heart twisted into a knot of failure. She had nothing for them, no milk. Her body had given everything it had. Shame, hot and bitter, burned its way up her throat. She couldn't look at him, couldn't let him see a mother so weak, so useless, she couldn't even feed her own babies. But he was already moving again. He crossed to the far corner of the barn where a small goat was tethered, bleating nervously in the straw. He crouched down, murmuring to the animal in a language she'd never heard, a series of soft, guttural sounds that seemed to calm it instantly. With practiced, gentle hands, he drew a small amount of milk into a tin cup. He warmed it by the fire, testing the temperature against the inside of his scarred wrist before offering it to her, still silent. Tears pricked at Lisa's eyes. Hot, angry, grateful tears. Her hands shook so badly she could barely take the cup from him. She guided the rim to her daughter's lips. The tiny mouth latched on greedily, and the sound of the baby suckling filled the quiet barn. Lisa choked back a sob, pressing her cheek to the baby's soft hair. When she finally dared to look up, the stranger's eyes were on her, and in them, she saw something that shattered her. Respect. Her voice broke. "You shame me with your kindness." His brow furrowed slightly, as if the words themselves were foreign to him. I can't give them what they need," she whispered, the confession tearing from her throat. "And you just do it." Without a word. He tilted his head, his gaze direct, as if her sorrow was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "A child is not shame," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They are life." The words hit her harder than Ezekiel's fist ever had. She looked down at her daughters, clutching them as if to shield them from her own despair. For her entire life, she had been told the opposite. Her worth was in sons. Daughters were a burden. His simple, steady words cut through years of that poison like a sharp blade. The barn filled with softer sounds now. The babies drinking, the fire crackling, the steady rhythm of the stranger's breathing. The storm still raged outside, but it felt a world away. She watched him from under her lashes, the way he moved with no wasted motion, the way his hands, large enough to crush a man's skull, handled the small tin cup with such impossible care. His silence wasn't empty, it was full of a kind of reverence. He wasn't just waiting out the storm, he was holding vigil. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten. Safety. But fear was a stubborn weed. It still lingered. What would the town say? What would they do if they knew an Apache warrior had spent the night in her barn? That his eyes had rested on her daughters? The venomous tongue of Abigail Crowley would slice her reputation to ribbons before noon. The sheriff, a man who valued order above all else, would call it a scandal, an outrage. She could already see the whispers behind cupped hands, the sideways glances in the general store, the cruel laughter. The shame rose again, coiling in her gut like a snake. She pulled her shawl tighter, as if hiding the bruises on her skin could also hide the ones on her heart. "They will never forgive me," she murmured to herself. The stranger's dark eyes flicked toward her. "Forgive you for what?" he asked, his voice flat. "For surviving," she said, bitterness lacing her words. "For being weak, for birthing girls, for letting you. Stand here now." He studied her for a long moment, the firelight catching on a long, thin scar that ran from his collarbone to his shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but it carried the unyielding weight of stone. "The storm does not ask for forgiveness for falling," he said. "Neither should you for living." She swallowed hard, unable to find a reply. The babies finally slept, warm and full, curled in the crook of her arm. Her body screamed with exhaustion, but she didn't dare close her eyes, not yet. As the fire warmed her bones and the stranger kept his silent watch, the shadows in the barn seemed less menacing. She drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep, and each time she woke with a start, she found him still there, still watching. Once, she woke to see him carving a small piece of wood. His knife moved with incredible speed and precision, the blade flashing in the firelight. The horses dozed on their feet. The storm outside raged on. He worked without hurry, his focus absolute, shaping the wood grain into intricate lines. He must have felt her watching him. He turned the small object over in his palm, showing it to her. It was a cradle, small enough to fit in his hand, etched with symbols she had never seen before. A sun, a river, a soaring bird. Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak. He placed it on the straw between them. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a burden. It was just a thing that now existed in the world, created by hands that had chosen to build instead of destroy. The night stretched on, a long dark tunnel of wind and snow, and still, he remained, a silent sentinel. Lisa thought of Ezekiel, his rage, his disgust, his boots stomping away into the storm. The thought chilled her more than the wind. She knew he would be back, and when he returned, he wouldn't just find the daughters he despised. He would find this stranger in his barn. His fury would blaze hotter than any fire. Her heart hammered against her ribs, torn between a familiar, bone-deep dread and the faint, fragile ember of something else. Hope. It was a terrifying thing. Her gaze found the man again. His eyes were on the sleeping children, his expression unreadable, carved from shadow and flame. Outside, the storm began to quiet, the world holding its breath. And inside, Lisa realized the true danger wasn't the cold. It was the morning. By dawn, the world was silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of brittle, glittering glass. Frost coated every surface, turning the Harper Ranch into a frozen kingdom. A thin curl of smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. Ezekiel was home. Inside the barn, Lisa stirred from her fitful sleep. Her daughters were safe, breathing softly against her chest. The fire was down to glowing embers. The stranger was gone from his spot by the fire. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he'd left, vanished back into the wilderness as mysteriously as he'd appeared. Then she saw him. He was crouched near the barn door, his back to her, perfectly still, watching the house. He was a hunter, waiting. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the snow in shades of pale gold, Lisa's heart seized with a new kind of fear. Light meant eyes, eyes from town, Eyes from neighbors, eyes sharp enough to cut. Word would travel fast in Willow Creek, faster than the spring thaw. Abigail Crowley's gossip was more reliable than the town clock, and by noon, everyone would know. Lisa Harper, the disgraced wife with 2 useless daughters, had sheltered with an Apache warrior. She dared to whisper it into the cold air. They will speak ill of me. The stranger didn't turn. Let them. The simplicity of it, the raw dismissal in those 2 words, struck her harder than any comfort could have. He spoke as if the judgment of other people was nothing, a passing breeze. For her, it had always been a cage. Later that morning she knew she had to face it. The babies needed milk, and the goat couldn't provide forever. Wrapping her shawl tight, she carried the twins toward the house. The stranger rose and followed, staying a few paces behind her. A silent, towering shadow. Every step on the frozen path felt like walking toward a hangman's noose. She pushed open the cabin door. Ezekiel was at the table, a bottle of whiskey and a dirty glass in front of him. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and narrow. He saw her, then the babies, and his lip curled. But when he saw the towering figure of the stranger filling the doorway behind her, a flicker of something else crossed his face. Not just anger, fear. He said nothing. He just watched her, his hand resting on the table, too close to a large hunting knife. Lisa ignored him. She moved to the pantry, her hands shaking, and gathered a few supplies. She could feel the 2 men's eyes on her, a silent war being fought in the small, tense cabin. She didn't stay long. She couldn't breathe. Back outside, she knew her next stop had to be the town, for bread, for supplies, to show them she wasn't hiding. The stranger followed. At the general store, the dozen or so people inside fell silent the moment she walked in. It was like a switch had been flipped. Men who had been laughing by the Cracker Barrel suddenly found fascinating spots on the floor to stare at. Women measuring out flour let their hands fall still. Then Abigail Crowley, wrapped in a thick wool cloak that made her look like a crow, let her eyes slide over Lisa, then to the babies, and finally to the stranger who stood just inside the door, blocking the light. "Well," Abigail murmured, her voice carrying across the silent room like the scrape of a shovel on stone. "Look at her! Not a day after birthing, and she's already parading herself with that." A few nervous titters of laughter rippled through the room. Most people just looked away, suddenly ashamed to be caught listening. Lisa's cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the pot-bellied stove. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the sleeping faces of her daughters. Her hands trembled as she asked the shopkeeper for a loaf of bread, her voice barely a whisper. Behind her, the stranger stood as still and silent as a mountain. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. But his silence screamed. It filled the room, pressing down on everyone, and one by one their eyes fell away from him. He was a force they didn't understand, and it scared them. Outside, stumbling back into the cold sunlight, Lisa's steps faltered. "They'll never let me live this down," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. The stranger looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You walk for your daughters," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not for them." The words were an anchor in the swirling sea of her shame, but the fear was still there, a tight knot in her stomach. Ezekiel's face, twisted with hate and whiskey, flashed in her mind. He was just biding his time. The town's whispers would only fuel his rage. That evening, Sheriff Dalton Reeves rode up to the ranch. He was a hard man, but fair, and he'd known her father. He dismounted stiffly, his badge catching the pale, setting sun. He took in the scene. Lisa on the porch, the stranger standing guard by the barn, still shirtless despite the biting cold. The sheriff squinted, his face a mask of weary disapproval. "Lisa," he said, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "Folks are talking." He didn't need to say more. "He saved my daughters, Sheriff," Lisa said, her voice trembling but clear. The night of the storm. Without him, they'd be gone. The sheriff's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Duty hardened it again. That may be so, but this town, it doesn't take kindly to this kind of mixing. You know that. The whispers will only get louder, and your husband. He let the sentence hang in the air. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. She glanced toward the barn, where the stranger stood watching them, his presence an unshakable fact. The sheriff followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened. You'd be wise to send him on his way, Lisa, before this gets worse. Her heart felt like it was cracking in two. The town was asking her to be a coward. They were demanding she send away the only person who had shown her or her daughters an ounce of kindness. But the sheriff was already turning his horse, his duty done. He left her alone in the twilight, with his warning echoing in the cold air. That night, she brought the babies inside the main house. She couldn't bear the thought of another night in the barn. She set up a makeshift bed for them near the hearth. Ezekiel was gone again, likely back at the saloon, drinking himself into a stupor. The stranger entered the cabin quietly, without being asked. In his hand was the small wooden cradle he had carved. He set it down on the floor beside the sleeping twins. In the flickering firelight, the etched symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She saw strength in them, survival. She reached out, her fingers tracing the carved lines. They will hate me for this, she said, her voice breaking. He met her eyes then, a long, searching look. In the dark depths of his gaze, she saw no pity, no judgment, only a hard, simple truth. Hate is theirs to carry, he said, not yours. Her breath shuddered out of her. She looked at her daughters, so small, so innocent of the world's cruelty. What kind of women would they become if they were raised not to carry shame, but to cast it off? For the first time she dared to imagine it. A life not defined by Ezekiel's fist or the town's scorn. A life that was her own. And that's when the sound came. The crunch of heavy boots on the snow, uneven, angry. The cabin door slammed open, so hard it bounced off the inside wall. A gust of wind and snow blew into the room, making the fire hiss and spit. Ezekiel stood in the doorway. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild. Whiskey fumes rolled off him, sharp and sour. His gaze fell on Lisa, then on the new cradle, and then on the stranger, who rose slowly to his full, towering height. A mask of pure, murderous fury twisted Ezekiel's face. You, he spat, his voice a ragged tear in the silence. You dare stand in my house, with my wife, and you hold my brats like they're worth a damn. Lisa instinctively clutched the side of the cradle, her heart hammering. Fear and defiance were at war inside her, a storm against a mountain. The stranger squared his shoulders, his shadow swallowing the room. Ezekiel's hand dropped to the pistol holstered at his hip. The air in the room froze, becoming thin and sharp. The world narrowed to the dark circle of that gun barrel, the frantic beat of her daughters' tiny hearts, and the profound, unshakable silence of the man who had saved them. And in that silence, Lisa understood something with chilling certainty. The town's judgment was nothing. The real judgment had just come home. Ezekiel's pistol gleamed in the firelight, the barrel shaking slightly in his unsteady hand. His breath came in harsh, ugly grunts, each one a white cloud in the cold air. Lisa was frozen, her hand still gripping the small wooden cradle. Beside her, her daughters slept on, oblivious. Between her and her husband stood the stranger, a silent, unmovable wall of muscle and scars. You dare? Ezekiel snarled again, his voice cracking. My own wife, shaming me before God and the whole damn town with this. Savage. Lisa's lips parted, but years of practiced silence, of bowing her head and biting her tongue, had stolen her words. Her throat was clamped shut with fear. But the stranger, Grey Wolf, she would later learn was his name, remained as still as a stone effigy. His dark eyes were locked on Ezekiel, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, calm rhythm that seemed to defy the violence coiled in the air. Ezekiel's wild gaze darted to the cradle. His voice dropped to a low, venomous growl. "Those things are a curse. I told you to get rid of them. Now you mock me, keeping them alive, showing them off like they're something to be proud of." Something inside Lisa snapped. Her knees felt weak, but her body moved before her mind could protest. She took a single step, placing herself between Ezekiel's gun and the cradle. A small, trembling shield. "Don't," she whispered. The single word was quiet, but it filled the room. It was louder than any shout. Ezekiel's face twisted in disbelief, then contorted with rage. He raised his free hand, the one not holding the gun, ready to strike the defiance from her face. Lisa flinched, an old, ingrained reflex. Her head started to dip, her eyes started to close. But then she stopped. Slowly, she lifted her chin. The bruise on her cheek throbbed, a painful reminder of the last time she'd dared to displease him. But she met his gaze. Grey Wolf took a half step forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He didn't reach for Ezekiel. He didn't have to. His sheer presence was a threat, a silent promise that this time Ezekiel's violence would be met. "You think he can stop me?" Ezekiel barked, spit flying from his lips. "This is my house, my land, my woman." Grey Wolf's eyes narrowed, his gaze like chips of obsidian. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "No man owns life." The word struck Lisa like a physical blow. Her breath shuddered. She saw Ezekiel falter, just for a second, thrown by the simple, undeniable truth of it. Then the blind rage surged back, hotter than before. He lunged past Grey Wolf and seized Lisa's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You'll learn," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath sour with whiskey. "You'll learn your place, woman, or I'll teach it to you with fire and blood." Pain shot up her arm, sharp and blinding, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she stared right back into his furious eyes, and her own voice came out, trembling but fierce. "My place is with them, with my daughters." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Ezekiel's face turned a mottled, furious red. With a roar of frustration, he shoved her backward. She stumbled, her heel catching on the edge of a rug, and fell hard against the cradle. One of the twins woke, her tiny cry piercing the tense air like a shard of glass. That sound broke Lisa's heart, and it forged it into steel. She knew in that moment that she could never bend again. She could never beg again. If she did, that would be the last sound her daughters ever made. Outside, shadows flickered against the windows. The townspeople. Drawn by the shouting, they had gathered in the snow, their faces pale in the lantern light. Sheriff Dalton stood among them, his jaw tight, but his boots were planted firmly outside the door. No one moved to help. No one interfered. They were spectators, waiting to see if she would break. The familiar heat of shame rose in her cheeks, but this time it was different. It didn't crush her. It fueled her. She straightened up, scooping the crying infant into her arms, her voice rising, clear and steady, even as Ezekiel raised his pistol again, aiming it directly at her. "They are mine," she said, the word a declaration of war. "And I will not be ashamed." The words rang out like a church bell, carrying past the cabin walls and into the cold night air. A murmur went through the crowd outside. Lisa saw Abigail Crowley gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Ezekiel's finger tightened on the trigger. The world was about to end in a flash of powder and a crack of thunder. But Grey Wolf moved. He wasn't fast like a snake. He was certain, like a rock slide. His hand shot out and clamped down on Ezekiel's wrist, forcing the gun barrel upward just as it fired. The blast was deafening. Splinters rained down from the ceiling rafters. The horses in the barn screamed in terror. Ezekiel cursed, struggling against the unbreakable grip, but Grey Wolf twisted his wrist with brutal efficiency. The pistol clattered to the floor. Grey Wolf kicked it, sending it skittering into the roaring flames of the hearth. The metal began to glow cherry red almost instantly. Ezekiel staggered back, his face white with fury and shock. "You think you're safe with him?" he spat, his eyes wild, glaring at Lisa. "You think he can protect you? From me? From all of them?" He jerked his head toward the window, toward the silent, watching eyes of the town. "They'll turn on you. They'll call you ruined, and I'll be the one they believe." Lisa's heart thudded against her ribs. She looked past Ezekiel, past the faces in the window, past the long, cold years of her shame. For the first time, she saw the truth. Dignity wasn't something the town could give her, and shame was no longer a burden she was willing to carry. She drew her daughter closer, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. "I will not bow to you. Not again." The crowd outside shifted uneasily. Whispers rose like smoke. Sheriff Dalton's hand moved to rest on the butt of his own gun, but he still didn't draw it. Ezekiel's chest heaved. His eyes darted from Lisa, to Grey Wolf, to the cradle, to the melting pistol in the fire. He was a cornered animal, and he was about to do something desperate. "Then hear me!" he screamed, thrusting his arms wide, playing to the crowd. "All of you! This farce ends at dawn. I swear on my father's grave I'll burn this house to the ground. I'll burn these brats, and I'll burn anyone who stands in my way." The threat hung in the frozen air, heavy and poisonous. A woman in the crowd gasped. The sheriff finally barked, "Ezekiel, that's enough!" But Ezekiel was already gone, storming back out into the blizzard, his shadow swallowed by the raging night. Lisa stood trembling, her daughters clutched tight to her chest. Beside her, Grey Wolf was an unshakable mountain. The fire hissed as the pistol's metal warped and sagged. Outside, the crowd began to melt away, their morbid curiosity satisfied. They scattered back to their warm homes, their murmurs trailing off into the darkness, leaving Lisa alone with the echo of her husband's promise. By dawn, the reckoning would come, and the storm inside her cabin walls would be fiercer than any that had ever fallen from the sky. The last of the townspeople vanished into the swirling snow, their courage dissolving as quickly as their footprints. The night clamped down over the valley, dark and suffocating. The blizzard returned with a new fury, a physical assault of wind and ice that made the small cabin groan like a dying animal. Lisa sank to the floor, her back against the rough-hewn wall, her daughters held so tightly they were a part of her. She listened to the storm scream and to the profound silence of the man who stood guard by the door. His presence was a tangible thing, a weight in the room that was more solid than the furniture, more real than the threat outside. He was watching the darkness, as if he could see Ezekiel's rage coalescing out there in the white chaos. She should have been paralyzed with fear. Ezekiel's promise to burn them all alive was not an idle, drunken threat. It was a vow. But the fear was now mixed with something else, something hard and hot and unfamiliar. Resolve. For 20 years, she had worn shame like a heavy cloak. Tonight, she had thrown it off. The act had left her raw and exposed, but also strangely, terrifyingly free. Grey Wolf had not moved. His stillness was not passive. It was the stillness of a wolf watching, waiting, every muscle coiled and ready. In that stillness, Lisa found her anchor. She found herself wondering about the scars on his skin, about the storms he had weathered that had carved him into this man of stone and silence. The twins began to fuss, their soft cries a counterpoint to the howling wind. She rocked them gently, her hand resting on the small wooden cradle he had made. Even this small object felt like an act of defiance. The symbols carved into the wood, the sun, the river, the bird, seemed to glow with their own inner light. They whispered of a world beyond Ezekiel's rage, a world where life was sacred. She pressed her palm against the smooth wood, trying to draw its strength into herself. The wind shrieked, and a sudden violent gust blew the poorly latched pantry door open. It banged against the wall, startling them both. Lisa rose, intending to close it, but her eyes fell on a loose floorboard in the back of the pantry, one she'd noticed 100 times but never thought about. Now, looking for anything to distract her from the impending dawn, she felt a strange pull. She knelt, her fingers finding a small notch in the wood. She pried it up. Underneath was a small, dust-covered wooden box. Her mother's. She recognized the inlaid flower pattern. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed linen, was a single folded letter and a small, leather-bound pouch. The letter was in her mother's familiar, looping script. "My dearest Lisa," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are in a danger I prayed you would never have to face." The storm outside seemed to fade away. The world narrowed to the words on the page. Her mother wrote of a secret kept for generations, a secret about Lisa's grandmother, a woman she'd never known. She hadn't been the meek farmer's wife of family lore. She had been a woman of the people, the same Apache tribe that called these hills home. And the land the Harper Ranch was built on, the land Ezekiel claimed as his own, had never been his to claim. It had been her grandmother's, a sacred trust passed down through the maternal line. It belonged to Lisa, and now it belonged to her daughters. Ezekiel. He hadn't married her for love. He'd married her for the land. He must have found out the truth somehow, and his hatred of the girls. It wasn't just because they were girls. It was because their very existence, their bloodline, was a direct threat to his stolen claim. He wasn't just trying to erase a shame. He was trying to erase the true heirs. The letter fell from her numb fingers. Her entire life, every word of praise from her father for being an obedient daughter, every cruel word from Ezekiel about her place, it had all been a lie. A cage built of lies to keep her from her own power, her own birthright. Grey Wolf had moved from the door. He was standing over her, his shadow falling across the letter. He looked from her face, pale with shock, down to the paper on the floor. He saw the name written there, the name of her grandmother, and his face, for the first time, showed a flicker of raw emotion. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice rough. She could only point to the box. He knelt, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he picked up the small leather pouch. He opened it. Inside was a single, fire-blackened arrowhead tied to a strip of leather. He held it in his palm as if it were a living thing. "My sister," he said, his voice thick with a grief that was decades old. "She carried a pouch like this. She was coming to find your mother, to deliver a message. She never arrived." The pieces crashed together in Lisa's mind, a terrible, sickening mosaic of truth. "Ezekiel," she whispered. Grey Wolf's eyes, burning with a cold, ancient fire, met hers. "He killed her," he said. It wasn't a question. "He killed her and took the pouch, but he did not know of the letter. He has been a ghost I have hunted for 20 years. The storm, it did not lead me here by chance. I was led by her spirit." The cabin, once her prison, was now the heart of a story far older and more brutal than she could have imagined. And the man who had come to save her hadn't come for her at all. He had come for justice. And that's when they heard it. Over the howl of the wind came a new sound. The crunch of multiple pairs of boots in the snow, and the low, angry murmur of men's voices. Grey Wolf rose, the blackened arrowhead clutched in his fist. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Outside, 3 figures were approaching through the blizzard. One was Ezekiel. In his hands, he no longer carried an axe. He carried a torch. The other 2 men, rough-looking ranchers she recognized from town, also carried torches. their flames whipping wildly in the wind, casting demonic shadows across the snow. The siege was about to begin. "Block the door," Grey Wolf commanded, his voice snapping Lisa out of her shock. He moved to the back window, his knife already in his hand. The time for silence was over. Lisa's mind, suddenly sharp and clear, raced. She was no longer a victim waiting for her fate. She was the protector of this house, of this land, of her daughters. She grabbed the heavy wooden table and with a surge of adrenaline shoved it against the front door. She piled chairs behind it, creating a makeshift barricade. "They'll come through the windows!" she yelled, her voice steady. "I know." Grey Wolf's voice came back from the darkness. A rock crashed through the kitchen window, showering the room with glass and snow. A torch followed, landing on the floorboards, its oily flames beginning to lick at the dry wood. Ezekiel's voice, distorted by the wind, roared from outside. "It ends now, Lisa. Burn with your savage. Burn with your filthy brats." Lisa didn't scream. She grabbed the pail of water Grey Wolf had brought in earlier and doused the flames, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the dying fire in the hearth and the flickering torches outside. Another crash, this time at the front of the house. Lisa grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the wall, her only weapon, and stood beside the cradle, her heart pounding a battle rhythm against her ribs. The back door splintered. One of Ezekiel's cronies, a big man named Jeb, squeezed through the broken frame. He saw Grey Wolf waiting in the shadows and lunged with a hunting knife. The fight was brutally fast. It wasn't a brawl, it was an execution. Grey Wolf moved with a fluid, deadly grace, sidestepping the clumsy attack. There was a flash of steel, a choked gasp, and Jeb crumpled to the floor, his knife clattering uselessly beside him. "One down," Grey Wolf said, his voice devoid of emotion. Ezekiel roared in frustration from outside. "Get in there! Kill him!" The front door shuddered as the other man, Silas, threw his shoulder against it. The barricade groaned but held. Lisa could hear him cursing. Then, a new sound. The scrape of a ladder against the side of the house. They were going for the roof. They were going to burn them out from above. "The loft!" Lisa cried. Grey Wolf was already moving, climbing the ladder to the small sleeping loft, as Silas finally managed to break a hole in the front door big enough to climb through. He was a wiry, weasel-faced man, his eyes wide with a mixture of greed and fear. He saw Lisa standing there with the skillet, and he laughed. "Gonna stop me with that little lady?" he sneered, advancing on her. But Lisa wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, at the front door. "He's all yours," she said. Silas spun around just as Ezekiel, impatient and enraged, tried to shove his way through the hole at the same time. The two men got tangled, cursing and pushing at each other in the tight space. It was the opening she needed. Lisa didn't hesitate. She ran not at them, but to the hearth. She grabbed the heavy iron poker, its tip glowing a faint orange from the embers. Up above, she heard a crash as Grey Wolf kicked the ladder away from the roof, then the sickening thud of a body hitting the frozen ground. Ezekiel finally burst through the door, shoving Silas aside. His face was a mask of demonic fury, his clothes singed, his eyes promising murder. He saw the bodies of his men. He saw Lisa, armed with the poker, and he saw Grey Wolf dropping silently from the loft behind her. He was trapped. "You!" he spat at Grey Wolf, his voice shaking with hate. "You should have died with your sister." "I am here to honor her," Grey Wolf said, the arrowhead now clutched in his hand, its sharp point facing forward, "and to take back what you stole." "That land is mine!" Ezekiel screamed. "This land has never known you," Lisa said, her voice ringing with the authority of her ancestors. "This land is my daughter's, and you will not set one more foot on it." Ezekiel let out a final animalistic roar and charged, not at Grey Wolf, but at Lisa and the cradle. But Grey Wolf was faster. He met the charge, not with force, but by yielding, turning Ezekiel's momentum against him. The two men crashed into the far wall. Ezekiel's knife came up, slashing wildly. Grey Wolf caught his wrist and with a sickening crack of bone, twisted it until the knife fell. He held Ezekiel pinned, the point of the fire-blackened arrowhead pressed against his throat. "Tell her," Grey Wolf growled, his voice a low thunder. "Tell her why you killed my sister. Say her name." Ezekiel's eyes were wide with terror, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He looked at Lisa, at the cold, unforgiving judgment in her eyes. "Her name was Mourning Dove," he choked out. She had the proof about the land. I couldn't let her." The confession hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. The sound of a shotgun being cocked echoed through the broken doorway. Sheriff Dalton stood on the threshold, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at the scene. Behind him stood his deputy and half a dozen men from the town, their faces grim in the first, gray light of dawn. They had seen the torches. They had heard the screams. This time, they had not stayed home. "It's over, Ezekiel," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with finality. Grey Wolf pulled the arrowhead away from Ezekiel's throat and shoved him forward. The man stumbled and fell to his knees in the center of the room he had tried to destroy, a broken, weeping mess. The sheriff looked from the defeated Ezekiel to the bodies of his men. He looked at Grey Wolf, standing tall and proud, the symbol of his vengeance in his hand. And finally, he looked at Lisa. She stood over her daughter's cradle, the iron poker still in her hand, her face bruised and tear-streaked, but her eyes blazing with a fire that no storm could ever extinguish. He didn't see a victim. He saw a survivor. He saw a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. He nodded slowly, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. As the deputy hauled Ezekiel to his feet, Abigail Crowley pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She looked at the devastation, at Lisa, and her jaw dropped. For the first time in her life, she was speechless. The story she had tried to write with her whispers had been burned away, replaced by a truth that was harder than iron and clearer than glass. The storm was over. As the sun rose, its light streamed through the broken windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Lisa stood on her porch, her daughters wrapped warm in her arms, and watched the posse lead Ezekiel away. Grey Wolf stood beside her. He held out the small leather pouch. "This belongs to your family," he said. She took it, her fingers closing over the smooth, cool arrowhead inside. It felt like coming home. The townspeople lingered, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and fear. They had come to watch a woman be destroyed. Instead, they had witnessed her being born. The whispers would never stop completely, but they would change. They would now be tinged with something new. Respect. Lisa knew her life would be hard. She was a woman alone, with 2 daughters to raise, a ranch to run, and a town to convince. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The shame that had been her prison was gone. In its place was a foundation of truth, solid and deep. She was not just Lisa Harper, the abandoned wife. She was the daughter of a proud line, the keeper of this land, and the mother of its future. Grey Wolf looked out at the rising sun, at the vast snow-covered prairie. His long hunt was over. Justice, in its own brutal way, had been served. He turned to Lisa, and for the first time, a true small smile touched his lips. "They are life," he said, looking at the sleeping babies. "Yes," Lisa whispered, pressing a kiss to each of their foreheads. "They are." And in the quiet peace of the new day, she knew that the cruelest winter can give birth to the most resilient spring. The stories we tell ourselves matter. The world may try to brand you with shame, try to crush you under the weight of its judgment. But your true story, your real strength, is born in the exact moment you refuse to carry that weight any longer. If you were moved by Lisa's fight for her daughters and her dignity, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss another story of survival against all odds.